Tonight, we're at the intersection of past and future. We're going to talk to two wonderful Nova Scotians who went out into the rest of the world and made good and became respectively Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, but they are not done. They have spent 2 days here at a summit talking about the future of Canada, the prosperity of Canada in the uncertain period after this catastrophe that we've all lived through. And they have a lot to share, both about their own experience, their observations about what was happening up at Rideau Hall in the last couple of days, and also a little bit about this coalition for a better future that they co-preside. Please give a warm welcome to Lisa Raitt and Anne McLellan.
Any chair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is great to see you both.
Wonderful to see you.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with this. You were both Natural Resources Minister at different times. Your tenures in Parliament didn't actually overlap. You came here in 2008 and you...
I left.
As did many Liberals in 2006. Yes.
As I say, we left in 2006.
And you had a lot of cabinet positions. I assume you were watching closely when the shuffle this week.
Mm-hmm.
What did you make of the shuffle, and what memories, good and bad, did it kick up? Anne McLellan, we'll start with you.
Well, I remember my first entry into cabinet. You may remember that I won my first election by 11 votes. And I didn't even know I'd won until 11 o'clock in a room in that hotel, the Westin. And I was quite convinced the Prime Minister had already asked someone else. There were 4 of us who'd been elected from Alberta, and that he had asked somebody else. But I get this call at 11. The judicial recount had just ended in Edmonton, Alberta, and his office said, you're in the cabinet, he waited for you, be at the Rideau Hall gate at 8 o'clock the next morning.
Huh.
And I actually did not expect that the Prime Minister would have waited, but he did, and I guess the rest is history. This cabinet shuffle that has just happened, or a new cabinet really after the election, I think maybe some surprises, but I think some people who have shown themselves to be good performers were elevated, perhaps given tougher jobs. And obviously Anita Anand would be one who falls into that category. I think a very strong performer in the first mandate, or sorry, the 19 mandate. So putting a cabinet together is really hard. And I think people don't always appreciate how hard it is to balance all the regional issues, linguistic issues, gender, skill set, cultural learning about the people, especially new people have been elected. PM doesn't necessarily know very much about them, doesn't know how he or she will work with other colleagues, with him. Mm-hmm. So it really is an art, I think, and it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Is it easier for a new government in some ways? Everyone's still learning the ropes, everyone's less experienced, but I sometimes feel like more seems possible when you just arrive in office.
Do you want to take that, or?
Well, I came in in the second mandate of Harper. So he was in 06, I came in 08, so I was the newbie. And in my case, I showed up at Rideau Hall, walked into the room, and a lot of the current cabinet ministers looked around and said, what is Raitt doing here? And then the second question was, what did he give Raitt? And so John Baird was the first one to bound over to me and say, hey, Raitt, what'd you get? And I said, I got natural resources. And the look of shock on his face made me really second guess what the heck I was about to get myself into. I was terrified. And then he said to me, well, what about the former Minister of Natural Resources? And I said, I have no answer for you on that one. I don't know. But yeah, that was the way it was set up for me. And
Gary Lunn was your predecessor.
Yeah. And then
I have no answer either.
And then you get whisked away by your deputy, and it's like you're hostage for 8 years, and then you're allowed out. That's basically my experience, Paul.
Were you well treated by your captors?
Absolutely. I value so much the relationships I built with the officials in this town. They are some of the smartest people that you can possibly ever want to work with, and good and kind, and I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot from them. But I was lucky. I had two women as my first DMs, and they really helped me navigate the ropes, and they gave me a lot of support.
I often got the impression, I'll stick with you just for a second, Lisa, that your government had a tense relationship in theory with the public service, but I almost never met a minister who was getting along poorly. I hear there were a couple, but it was rare to find a minister who was getting along poorly with their officials.
Yeah.
That when you actually meet people face to face, you realize you've got a job to do, you've got ways of working together, and that it was actually a strong relationship.
Yeah. So I would say this, that maybe that was the impression that was given, but I can tell you that Prime Minister Harper always told us that the smarter people in the duo was always going to be the deputy minister, and to respect the officials, and that they were there for a reason. They gave you good advice. We do the politics, we make the decisions. No one else makes the decisions, but they're there to give you good advice, and they oftentimes give you great advice.
What's happening to these new ministers now, the ones who are new in cabinet or new in positions? I get the impression that the sort of operational tempo of their life has just
changed
multiplied
dramatically.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say, especially for the brand new ministers, it's a combination of excitement, exhilaration, and just sheer fear, right? And maybe women do it more than some men, but I have to be honest, when I became Minister of Natural Resources those first few days, my inclination was to think, what am I doing here, right? Can I do this? What am I going to mess up, right? And then you get over that, and in my part, or largely, I think because of the deputy I had, who was the senior deputy in the government at the time, Mr. Bilodeau. And he was just this amazing gentleman, and I'm sure Mr. Chrétien had planned this. Here's this newbie from Edmonton, Alberta. I've just made her Minister of Natural Resources. You are going to have to make sure that she survives at least the first few months, right? And he was amazing, helping me adjust to the department, learn the files, start meeting stakeholders, and giving me confidence, that I could do this.
Yeah, they treat you like a minister right away. They call you minister.
Yeah.
And you are that person in that moment, so you are going to have to live up to it. When I was elected, when I was put into, I told Anne the story the other day, when I went into cabinet, of course I came from Ontario, they put me into the energy file, and Dalton McGuinty was the premier at the time, and I kind of came out of nowhere. I'm a woman, I'm a lawyer from Cape Breton in Ontario. Is she really a conservative kind of question? So there was a Toronto Sun editorial, and it was a picture of me crouching on a phone outside of Rideau Hall saying, "Hey Dalton, it's me. I'm in. What do I do now?" So I had that extra pressure of thinking, are these my friends? Like, am I part of this? So it's a whole new experience. Yeah. I didn't know anybody else. I never met them on campaign. We were all in our own ridings.
You've both been, as I say, Natural Resources Minister. The new Natural Resources Minister is Jonathan Wilkinson, who is clean tech entrepreneur. Yeah. Just a few days ago was Environment Minister. Yeah. That's a bit of a departure from the situation where the Resources Minister is often the voice of the oil patch and the voice of the resource producing sector, kind of in counterweight to the Environment Minister. There's talk that Wilkinson and Stephen Guilbeault, the new Environment Minister, are going to be a tag team. Does that make structural sense? Do you think that that's a good idea?
It may make sense in relation to the climate change file, which obviously is one of the 3 or 4 top priorities of this government. Jonathan, as you said, comes from environment and climate change. He knows that file, he knows clean tech. I think what Jonathan will be able to do, he has the respect of the industry, right? Oil and gas and other aspects of the resource portfolio, if you like. He's a straight shooter. And I think one of the things he will do is try and make the resource sectors, I guess, feel more comfortable around the transition that we're already in, right? There's no denying, nobody in Alberta in the oil patch any longer, at least the big guys, nobody denies that we're in a transition. We're in the early days of the transition, but we're there. And I think that part of the portfolio has a reasonable amount of confidence in Jonathan. I'm not telling tales out of school. I think they probably are more skeptical about the new Minister of Environment and Climate Change. But I think they're happy that Jonathan's in NRCan. And that, yes, he'll work with the new Minister of Environment because they just have to work together to get this transition off the ground and right. But I think you'll also see Jonathan being very pragmatic and helping make the case that the resource sectors are moving through the transition. It's going to be costly, it's going to take time, it's going to be disruptive, but if we all work together, we can get there.
Yeah.
Lisa Raitt, what do you think?
Yeah, you could say that Prime Minister Harper kind of did the same thing with me and Jim Prentice. Jim Prentice went into environment, I went to natural resources. The question is who's speaking for the environment if Jim Prentice is in environment and he's from Alberta. I thought it made perfect sense what the Prime Minister did. I actually had thought that they were going to do that, to be honest, because the NRCan is where the money is. That's where the program is. That's where people know how to roll out these programs that are going to be needed. So it would make sense for him to stay there. And all that being said, I thought Seamus O'Regan did a good job. I thought that he spoke well. I thought that he understood the files, and he worked very well with his counterpart in Alberta, Sonny Savage. And I hope to see that same kind of level of cooperation of this NRCan minister with the rest of the provinces. That
thing where you say nice things about a Liberal, is that automatic, or do you have to spend a few months learning how to do that when you get out of politics?
Hey Dalton, it's me, I'm in.
I do want to, before we get on to the sort of meat of the matter, which is what you've been doing in town this week. Once you're out of politics, were you looking over your shoulder at what was going on in Ottawa all the time, or did you enjoy a kind of a cleanse?
I wouldn't say a cleanse, no. But I also wouldn't say looking over my shoulder. But look, I mean, once you're in this business of politics, you are interested. I do watch Power and Politics or Power Play if I happen to be at home. And certainly during COVID, I watched it more often than I had since I'd left politics in 06 because I was working from home. So you're always interested. You're always keeping an eye on, the big stories of the day, who's moving where, who said something that you think, oh my gosh, that's not going to be good. So I don't think I would want to be cleansed in that was such a blessed period of my life, and the people I met on all sides of the house, remarkable people. So I still keep a watchful eye, and Paul, I will be the first to admit, some days I'm screaming at the television saying, how could that happen? Like, who let that person out, right? I mean, I do.
Care to name names?
No, I'm not going to do that. I am not going to do
that. Lisa Raitt, same question.
So I think it could be different between if you're in opposition or if you're in government. I don't know how you enjoyed being on the sidelines during the Harper years. I find it difficult watching what's going on with my party in opposition right now, but I have no desire to go back. That's the weird part. No desire to go back, no burning need to revisit where I spent so much time. I don't think that that's something that I would enjoy doing again. I'm glad I did it, I'm honored I did it, but no, I'm done with that, and I do enjoy the policy side. I'm very opinionated and I'm still partisan, but that all being said, that part of my life is closed.
I couldn't agree more, right? I think once you go, you probably should be gone.
Yeah.
Whether the voters tell you to go or whether you choose to leave of your own volition, I think once you're gone, you should be gone.
Yeah.
It's sometimes my advice to staffers is that if you leave the hill, try and throw yourself clear of the blast radius, so you don't get.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And Lord knows Maclean's has many readers who would like to throw me clear of this town.
Yeah.
So that's so much for closing a chapter. Now about opening a new chapter. You are the co-presidents of the Coalition for a Better Future, which just finished a 2-day summit. I have tried many times to explain it, but I figure it's your gig. Why don't you explain it? What is the Coalition for a Better Future?
It's about economic growth and the importance of economic growth to our shared, sustainable, inclusive prosperity. Lots of words there, but that's what we all want for our families, our country. And Lisa, I'm going to let you talk about the fact that nobody's been talking about it very much. And that's one of the reasons that the coalition has come together. 109 organizations from all across the country, from the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector, you know, everything from the Black Chamber of Commerce to the BCC to Imagine Canada, United Ways of Canada, Universities Canada, the U15. It is a diverse, broad group who think that we should be focused more and talking more about the preconditions for strong economic growth coming out of COVID and well beyond.
Yeah, and so 2019, 2021, 2 elections, not a single mention of long-term economic growth in either. Lots of talk about other transactional kinds of things, and lots of talk about targets, nothing about the economic growth that was going to be needed to ensure prosperity. So it kind of bugged me. It also bothered me that I'm sitting out in the private sector now, and I'm watching people and companies struggle with not really having a plan coming from the government level. It's like, what is the plan? What's going to be happening here? And then I go home and I talk to my kids and I talk to my kids' friends, and they all think that Canada's great. We're a really wealthy country. We're always going to be a wealthy country, and everything's going to be great all the time. And I think that's a big disconnect. And I thought at the time, why not? Anne was going to co-chair this. We had co-chaired something earlier that was I thought, really interesting. Very interesting on deliberative democracy. And this was something that really appealed to me because you need to have that discussion about economic growth. Anne was key for me because it was her government in the 90s that wrestled with the deficit and debt. And what I remember about the 90s was everybody talking about debt and deficit. How did that make it into the common conversation at the dinner table for Canadians? It's such a big economic concept, yet we were all on the same page trying to do the same thing. I'd like to see that for economic growth.
So one of the things that struck me was, first of all, just how huge this thing was getting as it approached. It was announced a few months ago that there would be this group that will be ongoing, and this summit that would essentially kick off the conversation. And sort of who wasn't associated with this group? You've got the Canadian Meat Council, you've got the LGBT plus Chamber of Commerce, you've got the Conseil du Patronat du Québec, every think tank, Canada 2020, Public Policy Forum. And the other thing that struck me is most of these organizations can normally already get noticed by government and have channels for making their concerns known to government. I assume the head of the Conseil du Patronat du Québec can get Pablo Rodriguez on the phone, or Melanie Joly.
Pretty much.
Yep.
So why this banding together, and why this sort of second layer of association?
I think people felt if we all came together, we would have a better chance of having, especially governments, and it's not just one, right? The tendency is to focus on this one in this town, but in fact, we're very careful to say this is about governments, because if we're going to have sustained economic growth, all 3 orders of government have to be at the table, right? Climate change is not going to be dealt with unless your big cities are at the table working on their own public policy, but working with the other 2 orders of government. So I think you're right that people can, have their access, whatever shape it might take, to ministers in Ottawa and political staff. But you are one voice, and you're usually viewed as representing your own self interest, right? Very focused on what that particular group might need at that moment. That's not what the coalition is about. We've deliberately asked people to come together to think about what we need to do together to have sustained economic growth. And that does mean that everybody parks their little short-term interests as much as possible at the door, and we talk about what we need to be doing and working on to get where we need to be in 10 years.
Yeah. When the government asks for advice and they set up a committee, the committee will go out and they'll ask for representations from people. So it's always the information like this. The government's controlling who gets to be asked, and the information comes this way. In this case, it's everybody's in the room together talking to each other and not talking to the government and trying to give advice. They're trying to come up with ideas amongst themselves and present a united front. And we got a united front, 97% agreement on the 3 big pillars.
Which are?
Go ahead.
Employment, economic growth and employment, inequality/inclusion, and climate change.
Yep.
Okay. Who did you hear from this week? A couple of voices that you heard from, and what did you hear from them?
Okay, we'll start with yesterday afternoon, I guess. We heard from Carolyn Wilkins, and she gave a really important anchor speech on economic growth, why it was important, and why this time economic growth has to include inclusion and has to be mindful of sustainability.
Carolyn Wilkins was Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada.
Yep.
Many people thought that she would be the Governor of the Bank of Canada at some point, and now she's out in the private sector. And it was quite a strong speech in which she said, we're not guaranteed a prosperity, and we should nail that down because it will, from that, all else flows.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah.
And just in relation to Carolyn, keep in mind her global perspective is very useful to us as well, because she is now doing work for the Bank of England. And she was the Government of Canada's Sherpa on the G7 meeting last spring. Right? So she's very connected to what the G7 are thinking and doing around economic growth. And that's very important in terms of helping us all have a better appreciation of, quite truthfully, what other countries are doing and what they've gotten right and what they haven't.
Yeah, member of the Advisory Council that we co-chair, which is really important. We rolled in then to focus on inclusion. And we had folks from, Alicia Dubois from Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Agency, and we had Goodwill Industries, and we had community foundations, and they really illuminated us to the real economy that's going on in the quote-unquote not-for-profits. They're doing extremely interesting things, especially Goodwill, where they talked about how in the United States they're helping with disabled employees, making it into the mainstream. And that, I hope in those cases, Corporate Canada, who's also a part of the coalition, is listening to that conversation.
One of the things we know is that there are an awful lot of people who have the capacity to join the paid workforce, but they haven't had the opportunity. The physically disabled community is actually quite large community, and one that has not been provided with the opportunities that you would expect, and they are not asked to join the workforce and work to their capacity. This is an expertise that Goodwill has. The Community Foundations of Canada, their president and CEO spoke in terms of the work they are doing around social enterprise, right? And how many of us, when we think about the Canadian economy, what do we think about? Do we think about social enterprise? Do we think about entities like Goodwill and others who actually are employing substantial number of people, giving them meaningful work, and giving back to the economy? Those people who are employed and building a social enterprise or whatever it might be, they are getting wages, they have benefits, they're buying things in the economy, they have, they feel, the head of the community foundations. This was amazing. Sometimes there's just a story that hits you. He came to this country as a very small child. His name was not Andrew, but that's what he's known as today, Andrew, right? Nobody in his class when he was 5 or 6 in Toronto, his little classmates couldn't pronounce his name. So his mom and dad and Andrew, because he was simply being left out, decided they would change his name to Andrew. He said, I did that to fit in. Thing he said, fitting in is not belonging.
Yeah.
Right? And that is something we should all take to heart, because it's about belonging. If we want actually to live up to the image we have of ourselves as Canadians in the world and at home, it can't be about just fitting in anymore.
Yeah.
It has to be about true belonging.
Yep.
I know you're very careful to say this is all about governments, but we have a government here.
Yeah.
Fired the finance minister a year ago, let the deputy minister of finance go, brought in a new minister of finance, the thickest budget document in the history of Confederation, 732 pages, and they would insist to me that it's all about prosperity and it's all about a long-term plan for Canada. In what sense is this event a rebuttal to that claim?
I don't know if it's a rebuttal, but I think what we're trying to point out to the government, this government, any government, is the fact that maybe they had a really thick budget document, but the Canadian public certainly don't see the importance of economic growth and prosperity. But there is a great importance for them to understand it and see it. And as a result, bringing together all of this group of coalition members who feel the same. Look, if that were the truth, Paul, if that were the case, that everything is fine, no worries about it, why do we have 109 people signed up in the coalition, and why do we have 14 people on this advisory council that are really impressive people within the economy to help us gather up information and figure out economic prosperity going forward? You know, sometimes during elections it can be very divisive. It oftentimes is very divisive, and we've had five minority governments in the last 7, which makes it really difficult to get any long-term planning going. And perhaps what we're doing in this case is just trying to get past the transactional kind of elections that are happening and set down a platform that measurements, metrics, that are going to be usable for any political party because it's focused on economic growth, especially since that room had people who vote for any of the parties that are represented in Parliament.
Can I just say, I actually read the budget. Not at the time it was delivered, but when I took up when I joined you, I thought I better read the budget.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, and I did. And what I would say, Paul, is yes, as I read the budget, I smiled to myself over and over again, because there are references to this plan. Mm-hmm. There are references to economic growth. I think somebody said there were 270 discrete initiatives, right? The problem, I think, when you read this budget is that the sum is not greater than the parts. You do have a sense of a lot of activity in the budget, but you don't leave reading the budget with a sense of what the real priorities are and what the plan is to realize those priorities, right? So I think the narrative got lost. Right? Around if their narrative was prosperity and economic growth, then it got lost in that document, and that happens to governments, right? You don't always get the narrative right, or it's not as clear as you would like it to be, and I think the narrative got lost somewhat in that budget.
It was interesting covering that budget, because where I came into this story was when the first budget I ever covered back in the midst of time was the second budget of your government, the legendary Paul Martin budget deficit busting document, and the old hands at that time, now long since deceased, told me that it was one of the simplest and plainest spoken documents they'd ever seen. It was a relatively concise budget, and it just said what it had to say. And the lesson I took from that is, if you're actually doing stuff, you don't have to spend hundreds of pages talking about what you're doing. You just do it.
Yeah, sure. And it was very focused, right? Very, because we knew what the world was telling us. We knew what we had to do. Yeah. So there wasn't any need for fancy prose, right? Yeah. I mean, it was, this is how bad it is, and this is what we're going to do to try and fix it.
And what we heard from the various speakers this week is that there's an opportunity for Canada, and we really need to take it, because if we don't, we're going to miss the opportunity. So it's that same kind of burning platform is in place, and that's why these folks are concerned about economic growth and prosperity.
Did you hear over the course of these couple days from anyone in government?
No, and that was deliberate. We will go and talk to them about our scorecard, and the coalition and what our purpose is, and we will. There it is, ladies and gentlemen.
She gave me the look. Hold up the scorecard, Lisa.
Show the
That's why I'm here. I'm just staffing in, guys. I'm just staffing her.
And we hope you have a chance to read this, actually.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah. That's okay. Anyway, I think I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I did.
Yeah. We're hoping that the government will look at the scorecard and take
absolutely.
it seriously. Yeah.
And what are the next steps?
Well, we do plan to engage not only interested ministers and officials in relation to the coalition and the scorecard and why we're doing what we're doing, but provincial governments, big city mayors who want to talk to us, private sector, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, the BCC, the CFIB, or quite truthfully, anyone who either a coalition member or those who aren't, and we're always happy to have more people join the coalition, and get the coalition members to amplify the message, right? We want the momentum to build, right? That this is not the end. This is just really the beginning, this conference.
Yep, and the scorecard is meant to be filled in and meant to be measured. So next year measuring against to see how things progressed. As well, going back to the advisory council, talking to them about what we've heard in this summit for the last two days, and getting feedback from them and the coalition as to how they want to proceed. But proceed we will, and create momentum and build momentum, and hopefully reach through so that normal Canadians, and they are normal compared to politicians, quite frankly, normal Canadians are talking about economic growth and understand the importance.
Okay. Now you've got me looking at the scorecard. What there's the green segment, which is essentially the
Living better.
Environmental section.
No, it's living better.
No.
It's living better?
No, purple is green. Purple is the climate.
Okay.
We did that to confuse you.
Yeah.
Well, now I want to know what living better entails, because I've been missing out.
That's Anne's favorite part. So, the
Oh
living better
gosh,
one.
you're
You
going
like
to make
talking.
me put my glasses on?
I am. 'Cause you always explain that one well, because I think that's a key indicator.
This one we talked about a lot, and other parts of the world, countries in the European Union use this. Share of youth, and we will probably define youth as 15 to 29, which is the OECD definition. StatsCan is 15 to 28, but immaterial. So the share of youth not in education, employment, or training, right? Not. You often measure who is in that age cohort.
Okay.
We want to know who isn't in an educational program, a training program, or at work. And then we want to say go to the private sector or government, depending. Maybe it's a reskilling program that's needed. Or maybe the private sector is dropping the ball in terms of going out there and finding people in that age cohort who are interested in going to work and that they've got the skills to work. So that is the kind of metric in relation to living better. And then it's also in a more discrete category called human capital, which is what it is. Are we wasting that human capital in that age cohort?
That's right.
If so, why, and what are we going to do about it?
Yep.
So these really are indicators that in at least many cases you can attach a numerical value to, and then you can drive those numbers up and down. Okay.
Yeah, all
Man, it's awful close to what they used to call when this government came to town deliverology, which wasn't hocus
Don't
pocus.
go there.
I don't know anything about that.
It was the idea that you measure government's performance by what you were seeking to achieve, rather than simply by what you had announced. It's easy to announce a program.
Yeah.
It's really, it's a lot harder to hit a target.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And once they figured that out, they dropped deliverology like a hot
Yeah,
potato.
we haven't heard a lot about it lately.
There's not a lot of deliverology going on.
I can't add anything to that.
This implies a pretty substantial long-term commitment from both of you. I don't know how long the long-term is. A year? Indefinite?
Well, we agreed to go another year.
Yeah. And we're looking at mapping these metrics out to 2030.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting Lisa and I will stay around that long. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But we will be mapping these till 2030 on an annual basis starting next year.
Yeah.
And we'll see where we are.
Okay.
And hopefully we will have a robust, competitive economy focused on innovation, clean tech, the tech sector more generally, using all the creative capacities of all Canadians who are able to work and want to work.
Because this is talking about prosperity, because it's to some extent driven by the efforts of the Business Council of Canada, which is the CEOs of largest corporations, some people will sense a sort of an essentially nefarious business agenda to lower taxes and prune back what has been an ambitious period for government. Is that it? Are you stalking horses for corporate Canada?
Are we fronting for corporate Canada? Is that what you're asking, Paul?
Did that come up? Did taxes come up once?
I think we're pretty. We put that to bed this morning with Paul Romer's discussion, which terrified me, made Anne really happy. But it was, basically he said very clearly to the room, and there was a lot of nodding heads in the room, that when people come to you and say, if you just give us a tax cut, we're going to be more efficient. What they're really saying is, give us a tax cut because we don't want to pay anymore. It's not as simple as that. Stuart Elgie from Smart Prosperity said that tax credits are what driving clean tech in the United States. Yeah. So that's how it came up. And then our comedian last night, Brittlestar, did a whole song about eating the rich. So that was a lot of fun as well too. But to answer your question, no. I mean, corporate Canada is as concerned as anybody is about making sure there's economic growth and prosperity. But as well, they understand, I think, because they're there, that this is about inclusion and getting it right this time. So it's not the top 1% getting all the benefit of the growth in GDP.
And in fact, yesterday, the subtext of the panel with the president and CEO of Goodwill, Community Foundations of Canada, Ray Williams from the Black Opportunity Fund in Toronto. He wasn't with us in person, but virtually. Yeah. And the Aboriginal Finance. I mean, the subtext of, they had wonderful examples of things that they were doing to ensure that people from their communities were included in economic opportunity, getting capital, whatever. But the subtext was really private sector Canada is not doing enough, that you're not doing your job. You're not identifying and taking on board and training up, reskilling, whatever the case may be, all these people who want to work, and you're not doing it. That was the subtext for me in terms of that session. And so this is not Lisa and me shilling, if you like, for big business in Canada. In fact, it's a recognition of the fact that through partnership and collaboration, governments, big business, the nonprofit sector, we all need to listen to each other, figure out where the gaps are, and start working to fill those gaps.
And there are certain things that only the private sector can do. Only the private sector, because the government simply can't do it. And one example that was given by the president of Moderna today. He said, governments tend to take a pot of money and try to spread it equally across the country based upon geography or whatever else in terms of ridings. Private sector doesn't do that. They take bets and they make investments. So you actually need to have private sector. We need the Business Council of Canada involved in something like this.
But that there are, as you've been saying, obligations in return. I mean, I moderated a panel on Canada's Long-Term Prosperity in Banff last weekend. They were very diverse perspectives, and almost the only thing they agreed on was that for a society to thrive, you need all hands on deck. You need women,
Yes.
you need previously
Yes.
marginalized communities,
Yeah.
you need new
Yes.
Canadians,
Yeah.
you need hiring officers who are not going to pick and choose among those groups.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Just on that point,
Sure.
private sector generally, I really think HR, I've sat on a number of corporate boards. You know, I hate to say this, but the VP HR sometimes doesn't get the same hearing as the chief financial officer at the board meeting. Actually, that HR vice president should be absolutely key to the future sustainability of any company in this country, or the world as far as that goes, right? That person has got to identify the talent that the company or entity needs and make sure the skills that are needed are matched by the people, and that you're keeping your people and you're creating the environment where they can be trained and trained up and keep up with the changes in the innovative economy. So that HR unit in the private sector is so important, and yet we, I think, sometimes don't quite value it the way we should.
But in the time when all we're talking about is the great resignation, CEOs are laser focused on talent acquisition and retention and training. So they care about this as well. They're paying attention.
We began this conversation, or certainly about this